The music was soft and elegant, the kind people play when they want a night to look perfect from the outside. Crystal glasses sparkled under the lights. Waiters moved like shadows, and laughter filled the air like perfume. From the corner of that grand ballroom, I stood quietly watching my son dance with the woman he had just married. Her name was Vanessa Collins, and tonight she looked like she owned the world. When she finally turned toward me, that smile, sweet as syrup and twice as fake, didn't reach her eyes. She tilted her head, let out a small laugh, and said loud enough for everyone at her table to hear, "Oh, Daniel's mom is so cute. She's like a fat little pig in pearls." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel in tone, but it cut deep anyway. People will always find a way to laugh when cruelty is dressed as charm. I smiled back the way women my age are trained to do, but my chest burned. Not from embarrassment, from restraint. Then it happened. A man's voice stopped the room cold. "Richard Collins." Vanessa's father turned sharply in my direction. His smile froze mid-air as his eyes narrowed, studying me. The color drained from his face. "Wait," he said slowly. "Aren't you Margaret Hale?" From the Hale Investments Board. The entire table went silent. You could feel the shift, like a gust of wind, sweeping through the room, invisible, but undeniable. Vanessa's laughter faded as her father took a step closer, now certain of what he was seeing. "Margaret Hale," he said again, this time under his breath. "You're the one who bought my company." For a split second, no one moved. Even the string quartet seemed to pause mid-note. I met his eyes and offered the faintest smile, the kind that hides far more than it reveals. The truth was, I had spent years preparing for this exact moment, though I never expected it to arrive in the middle of my son's wedding reception. 15 years of learning how to disappear in plain sight. 15 years of dressing modestly, speaking gently, and never giving anyone a reason to ask questions. And now one careless insult from a spoiled bride had undone it all. As the laughter died, I could feel eyes turning toward me. Vanessa's father still looked pale, as if he'd just seen a ghost from his financial past. My son Daniel was oblivious on the dance floor, spinning his new wife under a chandelier that glittered like glass judgment. I stood there calm on the outside, but inside a quiet storm was building. That was the moment I knew this night would not end the way they planned. Because the woman they thought was an embarrassment, the one they mocked for her simple dress and quiet manners, was the very person who now owned everything they built their lives upon. And I hadn't even started yet. My name is Margaret Hale, though most people barely remember it. For the past 15 years, I've lived the kind of life that makes people's eyes slide right past you. It's not that I disappeared. I simply learned how to blend in. And in a world obsessed with showing off invisibility, turned out to be my greatest advantage. It didn't start that way. When my husband Harold was still alive, we were both engineers. Not rich, not poor, just two people who believed hard work could build a safe life. We lived in Austin, drove the same car for 10 years, paid our bills, and never missed Sunday coffee at the corner cafe. We didn't crave luxury. We craved stability. When Harold passed away, I thought my life had ended with his. But looking back, that loss forced me to understand something most people never do. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers quietly behind closed doors. Over time, I learned that the best way to stay safe financially and emotionally was to keep people guessing about what you don't have, not what you do. So I built a life that looked modest from the outside. A small condo with soft lighting, a reliable sedan, dresses from department stores, not designer boutiques. My grandmother's pearl necklace was my only luxury, and even that carried more memory than money. It was deliberate. Every choice, every outfit, every quiet smile. People underestimate what looks ordinary. They talk freely around it. They forget to question it. And while they're looking somewhere else, you get to move freely unnoticed, unchallenged, unstoppable. I guess you could call it my strategic invisibility. It's how I managed to protect both my freedom and my fortune. I used to watch people like Vanessa women who believed wealth was loud, who thought money existed to be displayed, diamonds as big as marble handbags that could pay for college tuition. What they didn't understand is that the louder you shine, the easier you are to target. Jealousy has sharp teeth. Greed has perfect hearing. That's why for 15 years I stayed in the background. I went to family gatherings, smiled through shallow conversations, and let people assume I lived off my husband's pension. No one suspected that behind those quiet smiles were portfolios, patents, and a web of investments that stretched across industries. Sometimes I'd sit in that small living room surrounded by paperwork and spreadsheets and think of Harold. He would have been proud not because of the money, but because of the precision. He used to say, "You can't control what people do to you, but you can control what they know about you." He was right. Invisibility gave me control. It gave me peace. Until that wedding night, I believed it also gave me safety. What I didn't realize was that hiding too well has its own risks. When people don't know your worth, they start to assign you one. And once they decide you're small, they feel entitled to treat you that way. That's exactly what Vanessa did. She saw a quiet widow in a simple blue dress and assumed she could mock her without consequence. She had no idea she was laughing at the woman who once signed the papers that saved her father's company from collapse. Funny, isn't it? The world teaches women like her to chase attention and women like me to avoid it. But that night, as I stood under the chandelier light, I started to wonder if maybe invisibility wasn't enough anymore. Maybe it was time to step back into the light, not to show off, but to set the record straight. Because sometimes silence isn't grace. Sometimes it's the reason they think you can be humiliated in the first place. The Collins estate looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine. A private chapel stood on a hill surrounded by manicured gardens and a driveway long enough to make any guest feel small. It was the kind of place where the chandeliers never stop glowing and the roses never dare to wilt. Everything about it said one thing: money talks here. When I arrived, the air was thick with pride and perfume. Guests floated through the courtyard, crystal glasses in hand, whispering about the imported orchids and the orchestra flown in from New York. I had been to elegant events before, but this one was different. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a performance. Vanessa fit perfectly into that stage. Her gown shimmered under the sunlight like it had been stitched with vanity itself. Every camera turned toward her, every smile carefully measured. Beside her, my son Daniel looked radiant, caught somewhere between love and awe. Watching him, I couldn't help but think of the boy who once brought me wildflowers from the backyard. That boy had no idea what kind of world he was marrying into. I had chosen my own dress carefully, a simple navy blue, well-fitted but understated. My grandmother's pearl necklace rested gently on my collarbone. It was the only piece of jewelry that ever made me feel grounded, a reminder that dignity doesn't need diamonds to shine. The ceremony itself was beautiful, though I noticed small things others missed. The way the Collins family looked at me, for example, especially Patricia Collins, Vanessa's mother. Her gaze moved over me like a cold appraisal, the kind people give when deciding if something belongs in their house or in the trash. I could see the question in her eyes. What is this woman doing in our family photos? I met her glance with a polite nod and the kind of smile that hides far more than it shows. Over the years, I've learned that silence unnerves people like her more than words ever could. The rich, the loud, the self-assured, they feed on reactions. Take that away and they begin to show their cracks. When the vows were said and the applause faded, Patricia leaned over to one of her friends, pretending to whisper but not caring who heard. They both looked in my direction and smirked. The message was clear: I didn't fit. Not in this estate, not in this family, not in their idea of success. But what they didn't know was that I'd been in rooms far grander than this. Boardrooms where every handshake moved millions. Negotiations where silence was a weapon, not weakness. I'd learned long ago that the people who truly hold power rarely need to announce it. As I stood in that glittering hall, listening to the laughter of people who mistook arrogance for confidence, a strange calm settled over me. Patricia had her chandeliers, her titles, her carefully curated friends. I had something far more valuable: knowledge, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the company paying for half the wine they were sipping now belonged to me. When power dresses itself in noise and status, it's easy to forget who's really holding the reins. That day, as Patricia Collins glanced down her nose at me, I realized something simple but sharp. The louder the pride, the weaker the foundation. She saw a modest widow in borrowed pearls. I saw a woman mistaking social power for real power. And in that silent standoff between pretense and patience, I already knew who would win. It happened so suddenly that for a moment I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. 1 second, the laughter from Vanessa's friends echoed across the ballroom, and the next, silence spread like a slow wave. Richard Collins, the father of the bride, had turned to look at me. His expression shifted from polite indifference to something sharper: recognition. You could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. His hand, still holding a glass of champagne, froze mid-air. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice lower now, measured, cautious. "You're Margaret Hale, aren't you?" The name hit the air like a glass breaking. Every nearby conversation paused. I could see Vanessa's smile falter, her laughter dying in her throat. Richard so took a step closer, eyes narrowing as if he needed to be sure. "You're the investor who bought my company." The words dropped heavy between us, louder than the orchestra still playing somewhere behind the tension. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then all at once, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The guests, who had been whispering about floral arrangements and champagne flavors, now looked at me differently, curious, unsure, a little afraid. Vanessa's face turned pale. She stared at me as though seeing me for the first time, her carefully painted expression cracking at the edges. All that pride and superiority she'd worn so confidently just moments before now looked hollow. I could have denied it. I could have smiled, pretended he was mistaken. But the truth was, Richard Collins was not wrong. He was staring at the woman who had quietly acquired his entire empire 3 years earlier through layers of companies designed to protect my name. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight of that secret pressing against my chest. There are moments in life when time seems to stretch, when a few seconds can expose everything you've worked to protect. That was one of them. I had spent 15 years mastering the art of invisibility, blending into every room so perfectly that no one ever thought to look twice. Yet here, under the glow of chandeliers and judgmental eyes, one man's memory threatened to undo it all. I felt the eyes of the Collins family on me. Patricia's confusion, Vanessa's horror, Richard's disbelief. To them, I had been a simple widow, polite and forgettable. Now I was something else entirely, the ghost who had bought their future out from under them. My pulse was steady, but inside everything had gone quiet. I realized then that power doesn't always protect you. It sometimes exposes you at the worst possible time. I met Richard's gaze, offering a small, practiced smile. "You must be mistaken," I said softly, though I could see from his eyes that he wasn't. Behind me, the laughter had stopped completely. Even the orchestra seemed unsure whether to keep playing. The entire room had turned into a stage, and somehow I was standing in the spotlight. Vanessa's hand trembled as she reached for her father's arm. "Dad, what are you talking about?" she whispered, though I knew her voice carried farther than she wanted. But Richard didn't look at her. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on me, the quiet woman in the navy dress who had just shattered the illusion of his family's dominance. I kept my expression calm, even kind. I'd lived too many years pretending not to know my own power to let one moment strip it away. Still deep down, I understood something had shifted. The secret that had protected me for so long was now a double-edged sword. From across the room, I could see Daniel, my son, still dancing, unaware that the ground beneath his new marriage was already cracking. And as I stood there, surrounded by murmurs and half-finished champagne glasses, I felt the truth settle inside me like a storm waiting to break. For years I had hidden who I was to keep peace. But peace built on silence never lasts. That night, under the chandeliers of the Collins estate, the silence finally broke. The story of my fortune didn't begin with greed or ambition. It started in a small garage in Austin, Texas, where my late husband, Harold Hale, spent long nights surrounded by wires, tools, and cold coffee. Harold was an engineer with the kind of mind that never rested. He wasn't chasing fame or wealth. He was chasing efficiency, the kind of simple idea that could quietly change the world. In 2010, Harold developed a power management system that improved cell phone battery life by nearly 40%. Back then, it seemed small, almost ordinary. We had no idea that this tiny circuit board would shape the rest of our lives. 2 years later, in 2012, we sold the patent for $25 million. For a couple who had spent their marriage clipping coupons and calculating grocery budgets, that number felt impossible. I remember laughing through tears when the first wire transfer came in. The kind of laughter that comes from disbelief more than joy. Most people, after receiving that kind of money, rush to upgrade their lives. They buy houses with too many rooms, cars that impress strangers, and jewelry they'll wear twice. Harold and I did the opposite. We made a promise we would live exactly the same way, only smarter. We wanted our money to work harder than we ever had. So we really studied everything about the market. We started with conservative stocks, moved into growth portfolios, then real estate in places nobody was talking about yet. Harold had a gift for spotting potential where others saw risk. He would look at a shaky company and see a second chance waiting to happen. I handled the logistics, the legal paperwork, the small details that kept everything quiet. He built and I protected. It was our rhythm. By 2015, our $25 million had doubled. By 2018, it was nearly $200 million. And when Harold passed away in 2020, our combined investments were worth over $700 million. I carried on growing it further quietly and carefully until it reached more than $800 million. People often assume success is loud, big announcements, flashy moves, grand gestures. For us, success lived in spreadsheets and strategy, in staying invisible long enough to never be threatened. Every major decision went through a question Harold used to ask. Is this about revenge or about vision? Because the line between the two is thin, and once you cross it, you stop building and start destroying. 2 years after his death, that question echoed again when I saw the opportunity to acquire Collins Industries, the very company once owned by Vanessa's father, Richard Collins. On paper, it was just a smart investment. The company was struggling under heavy debt, but had strong potential. It was undervalued, poorly managed, but built on solid technology. The kind of situation Harold would have called a sleeping giant. I bought it through a shell firm to keep my name off the paperwork. Some people later wondered if I did it out of spite. knowing it belonged to the father of my son's future bride. The truth is more practical. I bought it because it was the right move. The irony came later. Life has a strange way of circling back on itself, turning logic into symbolism when you least expect it. Still, I won't pretend there wasn't a flicker of satisfaction when I learned who the previous owner had been. The man whose daughter had called me an embarrassment was living off the success of the company I rebuilt. He had once sold it in panic, convinced it was doomed only for me to turn it into one of the most profitable holdings in my portfolio. I never told anyone, not even Daniel. To him, I was just Mum, the widow, living comfortably but modestly, the woman who baked bread on Sundays and never asked for much. I wanted him to live free from the weight of inheritance to earn his own pride. I didn't want money to rewrite his character or stain his choices. But the night Richard recognized me at the wedding, all those carefully drawn lines started to blur. Maybe Harold was right. Sometimes vision and revenge walk the same path, and I was beginning to realize I was walking it too. My son Daniel grew up believing his parents were ordinary people who worked hard, saved what they could, and lived within their means. And in a way that was true. We just happened to be ordinary people with extraordinary secrets. When Harold and I first made money from the patent, we agreed on one thing: Daniel would never know how much we had. Not out of cruelty, but out of love. We wanted him to build a life that belonged to him, not to the zeros in our bank account. I've seen what inherited wealth can do to people. It softens their edges, dulls their ambition, makes them afraid of struggle. Harold used to say that easy money makes for fragile men. We didn't want that for our son. We wanted him to feel the weight of earning something himself, to know the satisfaction of building rather than receiving. So while he climbed his way through college, Harold and I quietly managed investments that would one day be worth more than we ever imagined. Daniel got a modest allowance and the occasional check for textbooks. When he graduated with his master's in marketing, he was proud, and we were too, but not for the degree. We were proud because he'd done it without asking for help. When Harold passed away, Daniel stood beside me at the funeral with tears in his eyes and said he'd take care of me now. That broke me more than the loss itself. He meant it. He believed I needed him, that I was living on his father's pension and what little savings we had left. I let him believe that. Because sometimes the kindest lie is the one that lets your child feel capable. Over the years, Daniel built a career he could stand behind. He worked long hours, earned every promotion, and even bought his first house with his own savings. I remember visiting once, bringing a bottle of cheap wine because he insisted on paying for dinner. He was so proud of that little home of the couch he'd assembled himself and the patchy backyard grass he'd planted. I didn't have the heart to tell him I could have bought the entire neighborhood in cash. That's the thing about motherhood. It's not always about what you give. Sometimes it's about what you hold back. Keeping the truth from him wasn't easy. Every time he mentioned struggling with rent or delaying a vacation, I wanted to help. But Harold's voice always echoed in my mind. Let him climb. Don't build the ladder for him. And I did. Until the wedding. Until that moment when Richard Collins recognized me and the secret that had protected him for years started to crumble. After that night, I knew the questions would come. And they did. The next morning, Daniel showed up at my apartment, pacing the living room like a man trying to hold on to something slipping away. He looked tired, his voice cracking as he spoke. Dad's old partner, Richard Collins, pulled me aside last night. He asked me things I didn't understand about Dad's patents, about investments, about you. I remember setting my coffee down slowly, pretending not to know where he was going. What kind of things, I asked. He seemed to think you were some kind of investor. He said you were at the board meeting when his company was sold. That you were. He stopped himself, as if the next words were too absurd to finish. Mom, he acted like you bought it. That's insane, right? I wish I could have smiled and told him yes, it was insane. But lies come at a cost, and after 15 years of silence, mine was about to collect its debt. I saw the confusion in his eyes, the fear that his mother, the woman who taught him honesty and humility, might not be who he thought she was. I wanted to tell him everything, how Harold and I had worked for it, how I'd invested not for greed, but for freedom, how I'd hidden it to protect him from a world that measures people by their bank statements. But all that came out was a quiet, "Sit down, Daniel. We need to talk." That moment still replays in my head. It was the day my son began to see me not just as his mother, but as a stranger with secrets. When you hide a truth long enough, it stops being protection and starts becoming distance. I thought I was keeping him safe from the weight of my fortune. I didn't realize I was building a wall he'd one day have to climb just to reach me again. And the hardest part, I wasn't sure he'd want to. A few days after the wedding, I got a message from Vanessa. It was short and polite, the kind of text that hides more than it says. "Lunch today, Daniel and I have some family matters to discuss." I already knew what that meant. When a newlywed daughter-in-law invites you to lunch at the most expensive restaurant in town, it isn't about family bonding. It's about control. The moment I walked into the restaurant, I understood the setup. The place was one of those high-end spots where even the napkins seemed to have a college degree. Crystal chandeliers hung above velvet chairs, and waiters moved like stage actors trained not to make a sound. Vanessa was already there, sitting by the window, her posture perfect, her phone placed just so beside her wine glass. "Margaret, thank you for coming," she said, flashing that smile that could have been borrowed straight from a corporate brochure. "I ordered us a bottle of Bordeaux. I thought we could celebrate becoming a family." I smiled and sat down, glancing at the label over $1,000 a bottle. A small but clear message. She wanted to establish the tone of the conversation, to make sure I understood whose world I'd stepped into. Daniel sat beside her, fidgeting with the edge of his napkin. He looked uncomfortable, caught between loyalty and confusion. I could see the lines of tension in his face. He wasn't here for wine. He was here for answers. The waitress poured our glasses, and as soon as she left, Vanessa leaned forward. Her voice softened the way people's voices do when they're pretending to care. "Last night I had the most interesting conversation with my father," she began. "He mentioned something about a mysterious investor who bought his company a few years ago. He said the woman in charge was quiet, elegant, and seemed familiar." She let that word hang in the air like perfume waiting for it to settle. I didn't respond. I wanted her to fill the silence to reveal how much she actually knew. She did. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, swiping until she found what she was looking for. "He showed me this," she said, turning the screen toward me. It was a grainy photo from a business article, one taken during the acquisition of Collins Industries. The image showed a group of executives signing documents at a long table. In the background, half hidden behind the lawyers, was a woman in a navy dress. My navy dress. The photo wasn't clear, but it didn't need to be. The resemblance was undeniable. Daniel stared at the phone, his brows knitting together. "Mum, is that you?" he asked quietly. His voice was careful, but his eyes searched mine for something truth denial. Maybe both. Vanessa smiled faintly, leaning back like a detective who'd just presented the final clue. "It's incredible, isn't it?" she said. "The posture, the necklace, even the way she holds her purse. Almost identical." She didn't say the accusation out loud. She didn't have to. The entire lunch had been choreographed to corner me politely, to force a confession without ever asking for one. I took a sip of wine and let the silence stretch. People underestimate silence. They think it's weakness. But in moments like this, silence is power. It makes the other person reveal what they fear most. Finally, I looked at her and said, "That's quite a coincidence." Her eyes gleamed. "Coincidences happen?" she replied smoothly, though not usually with billion-dollar transactions. Daniel turned to me, confusion written across his face. "Mum, what's going on? Why would Dad's company show up in a photo like this?" I could feel the walls closing in the years of quiet work, the careful anonymity, the decision to stay invisible for his sake. And now it was all coming undone over $1,000 bottle of wine and a daughter-in-law who thought she'd discovered buried treasure. I looked at both of them. My son, whose life I'd tried to protect from wealth's poison, and his wife, who was already tasting it. In that moment, I realized I had two choices. I could lie again and keep the illusion alive, or I could tell the truth and finally face the cost of all my silence. I smiled faintly and set my glass down. "Daniel," I said softly, "there are things about your father's work and about me that I've never told you." Vanessa leaned forward, ready to savor her victory, but she didn't realize something vital. In business and in life, the person who seems cornered often has the sharpest exit strategy. That lunch wasn't her trap. It was my test. And by the time it ended, she'd learned the difference between knowing someone's secret and understanding their strength. The next evening, Daniel came over to my apartment, his face tense but curious. He wanted to talk, and I knew what it was about before he even sat down. The questions had been building since that lunch, and now they were spilling over. He started slowly choosing his words with care. "Mom Vanessa showed me that photo again," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "She thinks you're the one who bought her father's company. I told her she was wrong, but I need you to tell me that too." There it was, the moment I'd been trying to avoid for 15 years. The moment when silence could no longer protect either of us. I looked at him, my son, who still believed his world was built on simple truths. Then I took a deep breath and decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time. Tell just enough of the truth to stay honest, but not enough to lose control. "Yes," I said quietly. "I was involved in the acquisition, but not in the way she thinks." He froze, confusion flickering in his eyes. "So? It's true." "It's complicated," I explained. "Your father and I made investments, some large, some small, but always carefully. The company wasn't a personal conquest, Daniel. It was a business decision. I didn't buy it to hurt anyone. I bought it because it was a good company that needed better leadership. That's all." He stared at me for a long time. I could tell he wanted to believe me, but Vanessa's voice was already in his head, whispering about power, secrecy, betrayal. The next day, she came to my home wearing a tailored suit that screamed preparation. Her tone was calm but calculated. "Margaret," she began, "I think we all want what's best for the family. So I've been thinking about how we can move forward, transparently." She laid a folder on my coffee table filled with color-coded tabs and legal terms. "It's a draft for a family trust," she said. "A structure that would allow us to manage the family's wealth collectively, protect assets, reduce tax burdens, ensure everyone's interests are represented." I almost laughed. The same woman who had called me a burden weeks earlier was now proposing shared control of my life's work. Daniel, sitting between us, tried to mediate. "It's not a bad idea, Mum. It could make things simpler. We'd all be involved." I turned to him, my heart breaking a little. He meant well. He thought fairness meant sharing. But in the world I'd built, fairness was a luxury that invited danger. "Daniel," I said gently, Money doesn't fix relationships. It only magnifies the cracks. Vanessa's polite mask didn't slip, but her eyes narrowed slightly. This isn't about control, she said. It's about unity. Families thrive when they make decisions together. I smiled faintly. Families also fall apart for the same reason. The truth was, I'd seen too many partnerships, business and personal collapse under the illusion of equality. Everyone loves fairness until they realize it comes with responsibility. And responsibility is something few people truly want. I poured myself a cup of coffee, taking my time before answering. Vanessa, I said finally, I've built this life on discretion and discipline. It's not perfect, but it's worked. I won't hand it over to a committee, no matter how well-intentioned. She didn't argue. Instead, she smiled the kind of smile that hides its teeth. Of course, I only wanted to help. As she left, Daniel lingered torn between love and loyalty. I touched his hand and said softly, "Don't let her turn this into a question of trust. What matters isn't who owns what, it's who protects it." He nodded, but I could see the doubt growing. Secrets, even when kept for the right reasons, change the people who live inside them. That night, as I sat alone, the city lights flickering through my window, I realized something simple and unsettling. I had built my fortune to protect my son's future. Now that same fortune was the wedge driving us apart. And the real question wasn't whether I'd let an outsider into my finances. It was whether I'd already let one into my family. A few days after that uncomfortable lunch, I sat across from my financial advisor, Jonathan Reed, in his downtown office. He'd been handling my accounts for nearly a decade, long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. That morning, as he adjusted his glasses and looked over the files in front of him, his expression told me I was about to hear something serious. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I've been tracking some unusual activity. Someone's been asking questions about your investments, very specific ones. Not the kind of curiosity you'd see from a journalist or a casual observer. These inquiries are professional, targeted, and personal." I didn't even need to ask who. "Vanessa," I said quietly. He nodded. "It looks that way. She's contacted a private investigations firm and a law office that specializes in estate disputes. My guess is she's looking for leverage, something she can use if this turns into a fight." A cold clarity settled over me. I had built my privacy on purpose, structuring every account and company through layers of protection. But no matter how careful you are, once someone starts digging with enough motivation and money, they can eventually find the roots of what you've hidden. Jonathan opened another folder and slid it across the table. "There's more," he said. "I ran a background check on the Collins family like you asked. It's worse than we thought. They're drowning in debt, mortgages on multiple properties, maxed out lines of credit, and unpaid business loans. On paper, they still look wealthy, but it's smoke and mirrors." I skimmed through the numbers, each line confirming what I already suspected. The luxury cars, the designer clothes, the lavish parties they were financed on borrowed money. The family was collapsing behind a facade of success. "She's desperate," I murmured. Jonathan nodded. "Desperate people get creative. You need to be prepared for whatever comes next. If she keeps digging, she might expose things that could complicate your holdings. She doesn't need to prove wrongdoing, just make enough noise to attract attention from regulators. You can't afford that kind of exposure." He was right. For years, I'd kept my empire in the shadows, operating quietly, never inviting publicity. I wasn't doing anything illegal, but in finance, perception can be as dangerous as guilt. All it takes is one rumor to turn a private investor into a public target. I leaned back in my chair and thought of Vanessa. A woman like her doesn't launch an investigation out of curiosity. She does it to win. She must have convinced herself that uncovering my wealth was a way to secure her position, to make Daniel dependent on her, or worse, to force me into a family partnership that she could control. But what she didn't realize was that I had already started my own investigation. If she wanted to study me, I would study her. Over the next few days, Jonathan and I went deeper. We pulled her credit reports, traced recent transactions, and followed the paper trail of her sudden business expenses. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. She had opened several new credit accounts, all in her name, to fund her private investigation. She was betting on a payout, some inheritance trust or settlement to cover it later. That's when I understood. Vanessa hadn't married my son for love. She'd married him as a financial strategy. She saw Daniel as a bridge, someone who could give her access to the life her parents had lost when I bought their company. Her family's downfall had become her personal mission to reverse, and I was the obstacle standing in the way. Jonathan looked uneasy. "You have two choices," he said. "You can confront her and risk escalation, or you can outmaneuver her quietly. If she's planning something, she'll overplay her hand. People like her always do." I nodded slowly. "Then we'll wait," I said, but not idly. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, papers spread across the surface like battle maps. I wasn't angry anymore, just focused. Vanessa thought she was playing a game of discovery, but what she didn't realize was that I had built this kind of game from the ground up. I'd spent my entire adult life reading people like her, ambitious, entitled, certain they were smarter than everyone else. The difference was, I didn't play for attention. I played for endurance. So as she dug deeper into my life, I quietly started building a file of my own on her parents, on every debt and desperate decision they had ever made. If she wanted to pull me into her war, she'd learn the first rule I ever learned in business. The person who controls the information controls the outcome. And at that moment, she still thought she was the one in charge. When Daniel and Vanessa came over that evening, the air in my living room felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I'd spent the day preparing not emotionally, but strategically. The documents on my coffee table weren't just paper. They were the truth, stripped of excuses and sentiment. Vanessa arrived in another tailored suit, her confidence polished to perfection. Daniel followed, looking caught between two storms he didn't understand yet. I greeted them calmly, poured tea instead of wine, and invited them to sit. My tone was steady, but I could feel the undercurrent of tension building beneath every word. Margaret Vanessa began in that perfectly balanced voice that pretended concern. "I hope we can talk openly tonight. There's been a lot of misunderstanding, and I think it's time we establish clarity for the good of the family." She said family like it was a business venture, and that was my cue. I smiled politely and slid a folder toward her. "I agree. Let's talk openly." Inside the folder were copies of her recent credit applications, payment transfers to a private investigation firm, and emails exchanged with a law office specializing in family estate disputes. Her smile froze halfway. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "These are records of your communications from the past 3 weeks," I said. My tone measured. "The private investigator you hired was thorough, but not as discreet as you thought. And this," tapped one of the documents, "is the proposal your lawyer drafted for a financial claim against me, in case things didn't go your way." Vanessa's color drained slightly, but she recovered fast, straightening in her chair. "I was only protecting our family's interests," she said. "You've been hiding things, Margaret. Big things." I had to understand what was really happening. Daniel turned to her, stunned. "You hired an investigator?" "Against my mother." "It's not what it looks like," she said, quickly reaching for his hand. "I just wanted transparency." I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "Transparency? I repeated quietly. You mean control? Then I asked the question that had been sitting on my tongue since the day I first met her. Vanessa, do you love my son? Or do you love the idea of being a Hale? The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Daniel looked between us, his breathing uneven. Mum, he started. But I didn't stop, because from where I'm sitting, I continued. You've spent more time investigating our net worth than investing in your marriage. I paused, letting that sink in. I've seen women like you before. You think love is a ladder, but every rung you climb comes with a price. Vanessa's mask began to slip. You're twisting this, she said, her tone rising. I've done nothing wrong. I just wanted to be part of this family, part of the legacy you've built. I nodded slowly. That's the problem. You wanted the legacy, not the family. Daniel sat there, frozen, staring at the documents scattered across the table. His voice finally broke through the tension, soft but heavy. Vanessa, tell me the truth. Did you marry me because you loved me, or because of what you thought my family could give you? For a moment, I almost pitied her. The woman who'd built her identity around appearances now had nowhere left to hide. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her silence said everything. Daniel's shoulders slumped, as if something inside him had finally cracked. The boy who once believed in people's best intentions was gone. In his place sat a man who had just learned what betrayal really looked like. Vanessa stood abruptly, clutching her bag like a shield. This isn't over, she said coldly. You can't just humiliate me and expect me to walk away. I met her gaze evenly. Then don't walk, I said softly. Run, because the longer you stay in this game, the more you'll lose. She left without another word, her heels clicking like gunshots down the hallway. Daniel remained seated, his eyes fixed on the door long after it closed. I didn't want to believe it, he whispered. But you were right. I reached over and placed a hand on his. Son, I said gently, love built on lies always collapses. The only question is how many hearts it crushes on the way down. That night, as the clock ticked past midnight, I sat alone in the quiet, the faint echo of Vanessa's last words still lingering in my mind. This isn't over. And she was right. It wasn't. Because a woman who feels cornered doesn't retreat. She reloads. The first warning came from Jonathan Reed, my financial advisor. His voice, usually calm and precise, carried a weight that made my stomach tighten the moment he said my name. Margaret. We have a situation, he began. Someone's filed a series of inquiries with the SEC official ones. They're asking about your companies, your investment structures, your shell entities. It looks like someone is building a case suggesting you violated securities law. I felt the air leave the room. Vanessa, I said quietly. He nodded. Almost certainly. The complaints are written like someone who knows the system but not well enough to be subtle. Whoever's behind this is trying to trigger a regulatory review. If it sticks, you'll be under investigation for failure to disclose beneficial ownership. Insider trading could get thrown in for good measure. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because I was guilty, I wasn't, but because I understood how the game worked. Once the SEC starts digging, it doesn't matter whether you've done something wrong. You're guilty in the court of reputation long before any verdict is reached. Jonathan continued. If this escalates, your name could hit public filings. That means journalists, industry blogs, and social media. Privacy gone. Your business partners might pull back, your accounts could freeze, and your entire portfolio would come under a microscope. This could spiral fast. For a moment, I said nothing. I stared at the skyline outside his window, The glass towers, the cranes, the movement of a city that never stops building or tearing something down. It struck me how fragile it all was. You could spend decades constructing something only for one accusation to make it crumble. How serious is it? I finally asked. He hesitated. Serious enough that I'd call it a strategic attack. It's not random. It's coordinated. Someone wants to corner you. I leaned back, my pulse steadying as logic replaced fear. Vanessa wasn't just angry anymore. She was playing offense. Filing a complaint with the SEC wasn't a tantrum, it was a tactic. A way to force me into the public eye, where her narrative could thrive, the manipulative mother-in-law with a secret fortune built on shady dealings. Let her play, I said. If she wants to make this legal, I'll make it professional. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Meaning we don't fight in the open. We fight where the silence favors us. That night I sat alone in my apartment, the city lights flickering across the floor. The fear that once came from being exposed was gone. What replaced it was something colder focus. I began drafting letters to my attorneys, compiling documentation of every legal filing, every tax return, every audit from the last decade. I built a wall of evidence so dense that no accusation could puncture it. If Vanessa wanted to turn this into a public war, I'd make sure she drowned in paperwork before the first hearing even began. But this wasn't just about defending myself, it was about reclaiming control. I'd spent years living quietly, believing invisibility was my armor. But the truth was, I'd mistaken silence for safety. And women like Vanessa, people who confuse noise for power, thrive when others stay quiet. So for the first time in years, I decided not to hide. The next morning I called Jonathan. If they're coming for me, I said, we're not waiting. I want my lawyers to meet with the SEC voluntarily. I want them to see I have nothing to hide. He hesitated. You're sure that's bold? Bold is how I built everything I own, I replied. As I hung up, I thought about Vanessa and the confidence with which she'd played her move. She thought the investigation would corner me. What she didn't understand was that every empire, quiet or loud, has a foundation built on strategy. And if she wanted a war, she'd just declared one on the wrong kind of woman. Because I wasn't the prey in her story anymore. I was the counterattack she never saw coming. 3 days after the SEC complaints landed on my desk, we were all sitting in a high-rise conference room, 30 floors above the city, surrounded by glass and tension. Across the polished table sat Mark Vance, Vanessa's lawyer, a man whose smile could slice paper. Beside him, Vanessa looked poised and confident, dressed like she'd already won. Daniel sat next to me, pale and quiet. His wedding ring caught the light every time he shifted in his chair, a reminder of everything this meeting was really about. Vance opened the folder in front of him and began without preamble. Mrs. Hale. He said, my client has asked for a fair and transparent resolution. Given your considerable assets and the harm caused by your deliberate concealment, we propose the establishment of a family trust. You would contribute $15 million to be managed collectively for the benefit of all family members. He slid a document toward me, 50 pages of legal ambition disguised as fairness. It's a reasonable solution, he continued. Shared governance, equal votes, full accountability. I looked at Vanessa. Her expression was perfectly neutral, but her eyes were alive with calculation. She wasn't asking. She was demanding, using the law as her weapon of choice. I glanced at Daniel. He looked heartbroken, as if still hoping this was just a misunderstanding, that his wife wasn't trying to legally bind me into her scheme. But she was. Every word of that trust agreement was designed to strip me of control. I took a slow breath and turned the pages without speaking. Let them think I was processing, deciding. In reality, I'd already made up my mind. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. Mr. Mr. Vance. I said thank you for your time, but before we go any further, I'd like to make my own proposal. He raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. I closed the folder, folded my hands on the table, and met Vanessa's gaze directly. You have 72 hours to withdraw every complaint, every inquiry, and every piece of legal action you've initiated against me, I said. In exchange, I'll offer you a one-time settlement of $5 million, paid in full immediately. The room went dead silent. Vanessa blinked. $5 million? To walk away? She asked slowly. Yes. And to never contact me or my son again. No calls, no letters, no sudden reconciliations. You and your family disappear from our lives permanently. Her lawyer's composure cracked for the first time. Mrs. Hale. That sounds like a settlement, I interrupted. A clean one. You get your money and we get our peace. Daniel turned to me, stunned. Mum, you can't just... I put a hand on his arm. I can, and I am. Vanessa's expression shifted just slightly as she tried to gauge whether I was bluffing, but I wasn't. I'd already prepared the transfer. Money was never the issue, it was the principle. Mark Vance recovered quickly. His voice smooth again. $5 million is generous, he said carefully. But it doesn't address the emotional and familial aspects of this conflict. I smiled faintly. You mean it doesn't address control? Across the table, Vanessa's jaw tightened. I could see the flicker of greed fighting with pride. $5 million could wipe out her family's debt and fund her next reinvention. But walking away meant admitting defeat and losing the narrative she'd built for herself. Daniel's voice broke the silence. Vanessa, he said quietly. Is this what it was all about? The money. She turned toward him, her mask beginning to slip. Daniel, you're being naive. You don't understand how families work at this level. We need structure, protection. He stared at her heartbreak and realization mixing in his eyes. No. What we needed was honesty. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. I stood and gathered my papers. The offer stands for 72 hours. I said, my tone final. After that, I'll let the investigation run its course, and when it does, I promise no one at this table will like what it uncovers. As we left, Daniel hesitated by the door, looking back at his wife. The woman he'd thought was his partner now looked like a stranger. When we stepped into the elevator, he didn't say a word. Not until we reached the ground floor did he whisper, Mum, I think I finally understand. I turned to him gently. Understand? What? He looked hollow but resolute. That love built on transactions isn't love. It's business. The elevator doors opened and the city's noise rushed in a reminder that life moves forward even when hearts break. Vanessa still had 72 hours to decide. But deep down, I already knew her choice. Because people like her don't choose love. They choose whatever pays better. At exactly 11:47 the next morning, Jonathan called. His voice carried the kind of calm that only comes after chaos. Margaret, he said, it's done. Vance accepted your offer. I didn't speak right away. The sound of those words, so final, so heavy, settled over me like the last page of a long, painful book. Vanessa had taken the $5 million. She'd signed the papers. She and her family were gone for good. No goodbye. No apology. Just a transaction. By 5 p.m. the money was wired, the documents notarized, and my son's marriage ended not with a fight, but with a signature. $5 million for silence, for peace, for freedom. Daniel came over that evening, his face pale and unreadable. He sat across from me at the same table where we'd once celebrated his wedding plans. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "She took the deal," he said quietly. I nodded. "Yes." He looked down, turning his wedding ring between his fingers. "So that's it. 5 million and she disappears. That's it." He exhaled the sound halfway between disbelief and relief. "You really just bought her out of my life?" I looked at him and shook my head. "No, Daniel. I didn't buy her out. I gave you the truth and the choice that came with it." He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was small, like a boy's again. "And if she hadn't taken the money," I met his eyes, "then you'd still know who she was." That was the moment something inside him shifted. I could see it, the mixture of hurt clarity and strange relief that comes when love finally loses its disguise. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired. A week later, he filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. There were no shouting matches, no courtroom battles, just paperwork and silence. The kind of silence that doesn't hurt anymore. It just lets you breathe. Months passed. Slowly, Daniel began to rebuild his life. He moved into a smaller apartment, picked up running again, started saying yes to dinners with friends. The lines in his face softened. The heaviness began to lift. And then one Sunday afternoon, he called. "Mum." He said, his voice lighter than I'd heard in years. I met someone. Her name was Sarah, a teacher. Kind, grounded, with a laugh that made people around her feel safe. When he told her about me, he said, "My mum lives in a modest apartment and drives an old car." Her response: "She sounds like a woman who has her priorities straight." That line stayed with me, because for the first time someone saw through the image and recognized the heart of what I'd been trying to protect all along. When I met Sarah, she hugged me as if we'd known each other forever. No hesitation, no judgment. She didn't ask about businesses or bank accounts. She just said, "Now I see where Daniel gets his calm." It was the kind of moment that reminded me what real wealth looks like. Not numbers or properties, but peace. That Christmas, my home was filled again. Laughter, mismatched ornaments, off-key carols. Daniel and Sarah baked cookies, while I watched from the sofa, a mug of cocoa warming my hands. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was healing. Later that night, as the tree lights flickered softly, Daniel sat beside me and said, "You know, Mum, I used to think love was about finding someone perfect, but maybe it's about finding someone honest." I smiled, feeling something inside finally unclench. "Honesty lasts longer than perfection," I told him. He nodded, then looked at me with the same warmth he had when he was a boy. "We're okay, right? You and me. You me." It took me a second to answer. "We are," I said finally. "We always were. We just forgot for a while." When he left that night, I stood by the window watching the snow fall. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the urge to hide behind silence or strategy. I didn't need to, because everything I had fought for, the money, the privacy, the armor, had been, for one thing, all along, the chance for my son to be free. And now, as the clock on the wall blinked 11:47, again, I realized something I hadn't before. Sometimes peace doesn't come from winning the fight. It comes from knowing when to stop fighting at all. After everything ended, I sold the apartment I had lived in for 15 years. It was full of ghosts, some painful, some bittersweet. But I was ready for a clean slate. I packed only what mattered and moved to Santa Fe, a place where the air smelled of sage and rain, and nobody knew my name or my past. For the first time in decades, I wasn't Mrs. Hale the widow, or the woman who bought someone's company. I was just Margaret, a woman who liked the morning market, who bought handmade pottery, who sat on park benches and listened to strangers talk about their lives. I found peace in small, ordinary things: the sound of church bells on Sundays, the warmth of sunlight on adobe walls, the way locals said good morning like it actually meant something. And slowly I built something new. I started the Harold Foundation, named after my late husband. It helps young engineers who have great ideas but no money to patent them. The first grant we gave went to a student from Austin who had designed a battery cooling system in his garage. He sent me a letter months later saying, "You believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself." That one sentence was worth more than any dividend I'd ever earned. That's when I realized wealth means nothing if it doesn't create something that outlives you. Daniel visited often. Time had done its work, softening the hurt, bridging the silence that once separated us. Then one day he showed up at my door with a woman named Sophie. She was a teacher, quiet kind, the kind of person who listens more than she talks. When Daniel introduced us, he said, "Mom, Sophie doesn't care that I come from money, mostly because she doesn't know you're rich." Sophie laughed, shaking my hand. "He said you drive an old sedan and love discount bookstores." Sounds like my kind of woman. I liked her instantly. She wasn't dazzled by what she didn't see. She valued presence over prestige. That night, as we sat around the dinner table eating soup and bread, I thought about how simple happiness can be when no one's keeping score. Christmas came, and for the first time in years, my home was filled with laughter again. No pretense, no performance, just warmth. Daniel and Sophie helped me decorate a small pine tree with mismatched ornaments. We sang off-key and burned the cookies, and it was perfect. Later, after they'd gone to bed, I sat by the window watching snow drift past the streetlights. For years, I'd chased control over money privacy image. But in that quiet moment, I understood something deeper. True power isn't about what you can hide or own. It's about what you can let go of. I used to believe strength meant staying silent when people insulted you. I thought dignity was about keeping calm and walking away. But I've learned that silence can also be a prison if it keeps you from your truth. The greatest power I ever claimed wasn't my wealth or my intelligence. It was the right to tell my own story, not the version whispered by others, but the one that carried my scars, my choices, and my peace. Now when I think of Vanessa, calling me a family embarrassment, I don't feel anger. I feel gratitude. Because that insult forced me to look at my reflection and ask, who do you want to be when the world stops pretending? Every person faces that moment at some point, the choice between silence and courage. You can stay quiet to keep the peace, or you can stand up and reclaim your voice. As for me, I chose to speak. And in that voice, trembling but steady, I found everything I had been protecting all along: freedom, forgiveness, and the quiet power to begin again. This story, though fictional, is inspired by truths that live quietly in so many homes. Truths about dignity, betrayal, and the silent strength it takes to keep standing when the world tries to make you small. Maybe you've seen a bit of yourself in Margaret. Maybe you've been underestimated, dismissed, or called a burden by someone who thought they held the power. Or maybe you've stood at that same crossroads, deciding whether to stay silent for the sake of peace or speak up and risk everything. If you've ever been there, you know the weight of that choice. Silence can protect, but it can also erase. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is reclaim your voice, not with rage, but with calm, with truth, with the steady decision to no longer be invisible. So what would you have done if you were in Margaret's place? Would you have kept quiet to keep the peace, or would you have fought back to reclaim your story? I'd love to know your thoughts. Share them in the comments below and tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moved, you don't forget to subscribe. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today, and stay tuned for the next episode, where another secret, another twist, and another truth come to light. Because every story, no matter how hidden, deserves to be heard.